A continent away from the Kremlin, a host of African strongmen now wait for the chips to fall over in Moscow. Russia's foreign minister took to the airwaves as early as Monday to immediately insist that it's business as usual for the Wagner Group's ties to the continent. Why the haste? Turns out Yevgeny Prigozhin's outfit are much more than guns for hire. It's influence, and it's also a cash cow. Thanks to a barter system that mostly is around gold and diamonds, Russia gets the gems, and after kicking out former colonial power France, the likes of Mali and the Central African Republic get protection. And also social media savvy to keep public opinion on side. So, what next? And what now for countries like Sudan, where Wagner does business with Hemeti, the warlord engaged in a death match with the junta leader? Does scores settling in Moscow affect the battle in Khartoum more broadly? For all the talk about the pros and cons of Africa doing business with China, with the West, can it be business as usual for those who deal with Russia? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at those ties between Moscow and the continent. Joining us from London, Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. Thanks for being with us.
Greetings, Francois.
His constituency includes Germany and Central Europe. From Munich, centrist member of the French Parliament, representing the French abroad, Frédéric Petit. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I am in Munich.
Nyagare Bakayuko is chair of the African Security Sector Network Consultancy. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
And Kevin Limonier, associate professor at Paris 8 University's Institute of Geopolitics. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Pay no attention to Saturday's aborted march on Moscow by Yevgeny Prigozhin. That seemed to be the message Tuesday in Pretoria when South Africa's foreign minister welcomed her German counterpart.
There isn't a mutiny. There was an attempted mutiny. That would be the language I would use. And it will not affect our intention of continuing to engage with both countries, as has been agreed by the presidents who were part of the Africa Peace Mission.
Did you hear that, Patrick Smith? It wasn't a mutiny that we saw on Saturday.
That's right. I think the South Africans find this a very double-edged sword. On one level, I think the uncertainty about the future of the Vladimir Putin's government in Moscow raises the prospect that the South Africans may not be faced with this tricky problem about whether or not to invite him to the BRICS summit in South Africa due in August, because he simply won't take the risk of coming. On the other hand, they don't want to appear to be dancing around his misfortunes. So they're certainly not going to appear to want to celebrate the difficulties that Moscow's having. So I think they're just they're holding back. And it should be said that unlike Centrafrique and Mali and Sudan, there's no overt Wagner presence in South Africa. So when it comes to the contest between Prigozhin and Putin, I mean, South Africa can actually afford to be conspicuously neutral, as they say they are in the war between Ukraine and Russia.
But for the time being, Kevin Limonier, there's an African summit in St. Petersburg in July. That's still on. That BRICS summit that you just heard Patrick Smith talking about, we'll probably expect that Vladimir Putin will not be going, but who knows?
Well, we never know because we know that there is this prosecution of the ICC upon Vladimir Putin, if I'm correct. The fact is, yes, there is this second summit in Russia this summer, and this will be, of course, a very strategical summit for Russia, of course, because after what happened this weekend, there will be some positions to be clarified. For example, what role will exactly play Yevgeny Prigozhin in Africa from now? We know that he's an unavoidable intermediary of the Russian influence on the continent. So will the Russian authorities try to circumvent this influence? Will they try to deal with it? That's a big question, and we don't have any answers now. We just have theories. And one of these theories is that the Russian diplomacy is already working on circumvention strategies of Yevgeny Prigozhin's influence in Africa. But for now, there is no concrete signs of such a thing.
And hence the fact that we saw, again, Sergei Lavrov being one of the first ones to go public on Monday, talking about Wagner's continued presence. When it comes to Wagner, we've seen the Russian president go from denying any link whatsoever to, on Tuesday, saying that it's the Russian state that fully finances it. African countries who are watching what's going on inside of the high halls of power back in Russia. Andrew Hillier has more.
Despite Wagner's failed rebellion, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov insists the group is here to stay in Africa. Wagner allegedly has its footprint in several countries across the African continent. The group is particularly active in Mali and Central African Republic. Roughly 1,500 of its mercenaries have been stationed in Central African Republic since 2018 to defend the government against rebel attacks on the capital. Vitaly Perfilev is Wagner's man in Bangui. He reportedly fought for Wagner in Syria. Dmitry Siti handles civil affairs. Both men work closely with local authorities, handling security and defense matters in exchange for access to natural resources. Wagner has a tight grip on the economy and works very closely with the government. But what's uncertain at this stage is whether both men's sympathies lie with the Kremlin or with Yevgeny Prigozhin. In Mali, Ivan Maslov calls the shots for Wagner. He's a former Russian Special Forces soldier, and he was in direct contact with Prigozhin, for whom he organized meetings with the heads of several African states. Unlike in Central African Republic, Wagner is less dependent on local power, but relies more on the Russian army for logistical support. It's unknown at this stage whether or not Maslov supported Prigozhin's failed rebellion.
Well, let's try to get an answer here. Nyagere Bakayoko, for those African leaders, but also, for instance, those influencers, the activists, the bloggers, the ones who tweet a lot, anti-imperialist messages. Who pays the bills? Is it Putin? Is it Prigozhin? Does it matter?
In my view, there is a need to come back to a perspective much more institutionalized on Wagner Group and less individualized. What I mean is that I think that Prigozhin as an individual has been put at the center of everything more often than not, whilst Wagner, in fact, is an institution with a very blurred legal status and also with a combination of public interest, private interest, and also probably criminal interest. And this is this mix which is of interest today more than the future of Prigozhin itself.
Well, so
and I think that the way in which the different activities of Wagner, in essence, military, informational, and economical, are conducted and controlled by local commanders, which are also of importance. So I don't think that Prigozhin is really seen as the core actors. In my view, it is much more the Russian state, which is considered as the main partner by African states and, in a lesser extent, by civil societies.
Why have we seen, for instance, prominent, outspoken activists, anti-French activists, let's call them that, go relatively quiet? They've barely tweeted in the last 72 hours. Why?
Yes, and it is also the case of African leaders, in fact, except in the Central African Republic, because I think they definitely know that their forthcoming main partners will be the Russian institutions and not Prigozhin himself, in my view.
Shouldn't they then be saying, "I heart Putin" on their Twitter accounts?
Yes, certainly. And I think once again that the declaration of one of the main counselor of President Touadéra is very interesting, because yesterday he declared that their partner is the Russian state. It is a bilateral agreement, and they will work with whatever actor which will be designated to stand for Wagner, for Prigozhin itself.
Frédéric Petit, have you been watching the silence, that relative silence we've heard both from the Central African Republic and from Mali?
Yes, I will say two things. First thing, I come back to the first discussion about South Africa. There is one thing that you didn't mention, which is important, that the BRICS were in Paris last week for the meeting. It was not sure that they would come, but every BRICS came in Paris for the discussion about the new financing of the new world financing, and I think it was a sign. I come back to Prigozhin. I completely agree about what was said by Mrs. Navarro. It is an enterprise. Prigozhin wanted to close his branch in Ukraine, but what will be what is constructed in Africa is independent. It's an Africa branch, and I don't think so. I don't think that it will have a big impact on the local, on the daily work of what Wagner is doing in Africa. Why? Because Wagner in Africa, for me, the main purpose of Wagner in Africa, it is the resources. It is the resources, the cash machine, the resources. And they are acting, but they are not very good in military, for example. They were not, when they are engaged, they are not very good. It's not very easy. It's not very difficult to be better than the locals. And influence is, for me, they are using influence not for Russia, but for the resources. I think that their enterprise, because it's an enterprise, their enterprise is organized in this hierarchy. Then it's not the fact that it is Russia or not will not change a lot on the field. I think in Africa they will continue to organize themselves in order to get to keep their hand on the resources, and that the reason why they are waiting. Well, when there is each enterprise was working in enterprise,
so it will be
instruction.
It will be business as usual. Kevin Limonier,
with a new boss.
With whoever the new boss may be.
Yes.
But then, Kevin Limonier, why have we heard more from Bamako, from Bangui?
Well, I think that I agree with what was said about the fact that Wagner is an enterprise, an endeavor. I don't know how to call it. It's a galaxy of actors.
Yeah, we can show on that. It was back in February. The Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime put out a diagram. We must warn you, it's not exactly TV friendly. There you see it. Yeah. I won't explain everything. I'll just say there's engineering in there, there's security firms, troll farms with that internet research agency, mining, and different color schemes to show businesses in Madagascar, Sudan, CAR. Okay, so that's the diagram. So this is super complicated.
No, it's not complicated for post-Soviet corruption schemes. I can assure you, this is just the top of the iceberg. This is something very classical in post-Soviet Russia. You create a lot of companies to diversify your assets and to be careful about it. What is interesting with Wagner, let's call it Wagner, in Africa, is that it's not only an economical enterprise, it's also a geopolitical one. Absolutely. Because what they are doing is, of course, earning a lot of money, that's for sure. but they are also earning a lot of political and geopolitical, how could I say it in English, credit, which is profitable to the Kremlin, to the authorities, to the representation of Russia as a geopolitical power which is rising again in Africa. So we have to understand this phenomenon in the long term. Why is Wagner and its informational empire in Africa so influent? Because they played on the fact that Russia shall be the legacy of the anti-colonial Soviet, the anti-colonial role the Soviet Union was playing in Africa 30, 40, 50 years ago. So this is not only about economy. This is about politics. This is about geopolitics, about how do you read what is happening in Africa, what kind of ideological direction do you want to give to some ideological movements such as Pan-Africanism, etc. And I would say also that everything depends.
They can still have this Pan-Africanist rhetoric, even though
they don't
Russia's
have it.
Being imperialist in Ukraine.
They don't have it. They amplify the fact, they amplify local actors which are Pan-Africanists, and they will give them the means, the technical, the financial means to amplify what they are saying. They were already saying, for example, that France was arming terrorists. It was a conspiracy theory that was existing in Africa prior to the arrival of Russia. But when Russia arrived, they just made it blow on the social networks. And everything will depend now on the fact, on whether Prigozhin wants a political future or not. Because if he doesn't want a political future in Russia, so yes, it can be only an economical endeavor in Africa, looting resources, etc. That's fine. But what we saw is that the guy can have a political ambition. We saw 2 days before the uprising, we saw some posters in south of Russia stating Prigozhin 2024. Maybe that's just a prank, I don't know, but there are a lot of signs that Prigozhin wants to be into politics. And so this time it was not the right time for many reasons, but what he wants is maybe to have a political destiny. And if he wants a political destiny, so he wants to add a geopolitical added value to what he's doing in Africa.
And so at this point in time, is that relative quiet we're talking about, Nyagere Bakayoko, because people don't know who's going to win this showdown?
No. Once again, I think that it is absolutely crucial to consider Wagner as an influence tool for the Russian foreign policy. And today, Africa is really
unless Kevin is right and that Prigozhin wants to also use it to amplify his own message.
But I'm not sure Prigozhin has its own messages on the African continent, at least. I will not say anything about Ukraine. But to be honest, I cannot see beyond the exploitation of natural resources, etc., a central role for him as such, because that's true that the central role of Wagner in Africa is informational. And I think he has been playing a very important role, but is not alone in doing that. And as mentioned, there is a network of both lieutenants, Russian lieutenants on the ground, and of African figures as well, which are also very close to the Kremlin. If we are thinking about Kemi Seba, for instance, or Nathalie Yamb themselves, yes, they might be, and they are probably linked
these
to
are these
Prigozhin.
Activists who are very
absolutely, but I would be very surprised if they would choose to support Prigozhin rather than to be again at the center of the next Russian summit.
All right, both of them keeping quiet if they do have a favorite among the two. It's interesting. Coincidence of the calendar, as everything is happening in Moscow, Mali has requested the postponement by a few days of the vote to end the UN's peacekeeping mission there. A draft resolution sponsored by a Permanent Security Council member France calls for the 12,000 blue helmets there to leave over the next 6 months. This after the Malian foreign minister earlier this month issued a shock call in New York for the departure of the United Nations mission known as MINUSMA.
International regulations, particularly those provided by the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali since its creation in 2013, have clearly shown their limits. Otherwise, how to explain that the security situation in Mali in 2013 was much better than today?
Frédéric Petit, will the events in Moscow in any way impact what's happening with that UN pullout that's starting to materialize?
I don't think I completely agreed from the and then I think that there is something, maybe I'm closer of that, but I am not sure that Prigozhin is a big boss. Prigozhin is a big boss. There were in the Belarusian media today a very vulgar and interview how he came back, how he began his moving. I think that Prigozhin for me is an underpile, as we say in France. I don't know the term in English.
An underling.
Yes, he will not enter politics. He's under order. He's a guy. He has his place, his right place in the big galaxy that we saw, and he had to make something in Ukraine that was not possible. He said, "I have to stop in Ukraine. What can I do?" He had no answer, and I don't believe that he made that there is a kind of plan for him. I think he was on defensive. I remind everybody that he's in concurrence because there is Reduta. Reduta is the militia of Shoigu. There is last week the first private militia from Gazprom arrived in Ukraine.
So there are other private military groups there.
Yes. There are other. There are in Russia. He's not the only one, but he's not cultivated. He's really for me, he's really limited, and I don't believe that he's the real boss of the big galaxy, of the big enterprise, and he's not the manager of Wagner. He's maybe formally he has a kind of ownership. He has surely a kind of leadership for some activities. I am not expecting that he is dealing with all Wagner and preparing his own second life. I don't believe in that. I think maybe he will have a new task in Belarus. That is possible. But I don't believe that there is.
You don't believe
that the Wagner is linked to Prigozhin as in Africa.
All right. So there's consensus on that point. Regarding Mali, Nyegere Bakayoko, just a quick aside on this. We've just had the German defense minister saying that he wants to speed up withdrawal of his blue helmets from that country. Mali has burned its bridges with the former colonial power France. It's now burning its bridges with the United Nations. The junta there. With
ECOWAS, also with G5 Sahel.
This delay of a few days of the final resolution at the UN, is it in any way linked to what's happening in Russia?
No, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I think there is presently a negotiation around the conditions according to which MINUSMA will leave the country. And all is related to the period of time which will be needed. It seems that Malians are asking troops to leave Mali in the last forthcoming months, whilst others, including China and Ghana, because they have the more important contingent in the country, considering as too quick. But I don't think it has any relation with what happened this weekend in Russia.
Frédéric Petit, they're touching on a point, which is, of course, there is not just one private military company operating in Ukraine. There are several. In fact, there are more and more. On Monday morning, the European Commissioner in charge of the EU's war effort, Thierry Breton, was asked on French radio and asked aloud, what happens if Moscow stops paying Wagner mercenaries?
It should make us think of those who've called on Wagner. I think especially of Mali and Burkina Faso. We can see that these militias are being overpaid, then loot those countries. And if one day they can't afford to pay anymore, maybe we could see what could happen.
Patrick Smith, I don't know how well briefed Thierry Breton was on the matter. Officially, of course, Wagner is not present in Burkina Faso.
No, although the Ghana president, Nana Akufo-Addo, told the US-Africa summit back in December that his security agencies had evidence of Wagner operatives in Burkina Faso. He wasn't very specific about what their job was there. There are a couple of Russian-owned mines in Burkina Faso. It's also worth noting that jihadi groups have taken over about two-thirds of the provinces in Burkina Faso, and some of that territory includes the Russian mines. So you can imagine that Wagner operatives would have a reason to be there. I think the key countries in all this, as has been discussed, Mali is the most important one. Burkina Faso is second most important because the jihadis are actually making more progress in terms of taking territory in Burkina than they are in Mali. And Centrafrique is probably, in terms of Wagner, it's the most important one because it's the only one where they've actually succeeded in doing what they were asked to do, which was to defeat the rebellion. So the 1,500 Wagner operatives in Centrafrique have not only propped up Touadéra against the armed rebels, but they've been given substantive areas of territory to mine and to bring some of the mining equipment in undercover from Cameroon, for example. And so they've got an operation that is making the Wagner group quite a handsome income, and they've actually succeeded in what they were doing in military terms. But in Mali, their operation has been a total failure. The number of successful jihadi attacks has gone up sharply over the last 3 years, where Wagner has been on the ground in Mali. And what's worse is, as has been reported a year ago, there was this appalling massacre in Mora in Mali, where over 500 civilians were killed by Wagner operatives and Mali national soldiers. And so that's really damaged both the image of the Mali army in the eyes of its own people and in terms of the region, the image of Wagner. So I think it's a very, very mixed picture. The last thing I wanted to say, Francois, was, I would really emphasize the origins of Wagner. Back in 2014, in the Ukraine operation, there were a sponsored department of the GRU. They were absolutely a government enterprise in a sort of spun-off, privatized version. But it was more like the East India Company with the backing of the state than any sort of new age private corporation. And it seems to be clear from what Lavrov was saying on Monday that they want to default back to that. And he says the relationship between the governments of Mali, Centrafrique, and Burkina Faso are with Russia, with Moscow. It's not with any individual owner of a military enterprise.
Kevin Limonier, of course, we're having all this scrutiny. We've talked about Wagner before. Niagale's been here, graced us with her presence many a time to talk about Wagner. But now this is like a newfound scrutiny. Will this have an impact on public opinion among Russia's allies, the ones we've mentioned on the continent?
I think one of the problem we have, and I think what happened this weekend is pretty clear about it, is that we don't know at what point the whole structure of the Russian system, the Russian apparatus, shall we call it like it, is weak or on the verge of collapsing. We don't know. But the fact is that when you have a column of mercenaries heading to Moscow from Rostov, which is very far, heading to Moscow north, arriving at 200 kilometers south from the capital without almost anybody to stop it, anybody willing to die for defending the stability of the regime, well, this is quite worrying. And I think that, we shall not overestimate the solidity of the Russian power, and we shall not overestimate its capacity of coordinating now, not 2 years ago, but now, of coordinating all these actors, all these entrepreneurs of influence. It is managing all around the globe, like Prigozhin, but there are many others in Africa, Konstantin Malafeev and many others.
And if the Kremlin is anything like the Russian military with a very vertical power, structure power, is that possible? Can you keep a lid on it if you've got problems in your own house?
Well, that's a big question. We don't know for the moment. I think we have to be very humble about what we know or what we do not know, because if we do not, we do what we call criminology, and which is like trying to figure out what is happening and behind these big red walls in Moscow. And the fact is we don't know.
The fact is we don't know. That's sound words there. While we speculate on the geopolitics of a continent, on Kremlinology, well, spare a thought for the citizens of Sudan, caught in the crossfire of a showdown between rival generals during the Muslim feast of Eid.
Sudanese people deserve better. They've been suffering for so long, and they still have strong faith in God. Look how they continue their rituals amidst the fighting.
Patrick Smith, in the case of Sudan, you have the makings of a civil war, and Wagner is squarely on one side. Hemeti, head of the Rapid Support Forces, he's been dealing directly with Moscow on the eve of Vladimir Putin's all-out invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. The New York Times reported on that trip that he made to the Russian capital. There we quoted U.S. officials in the article as saying that although the trip was ostensibly to discuss an economic aid package, Hemeti, also known as General Hamdan, arrived with gold bullion on his plane and asked Russian officials for help in acquiring armed drones. It's clear that if Russia has a stake in only one side in this fight?
Well, I think that's where it gets really complicated, Francois, although because it's evident that Hemeti and Prigozhin have been doing business together in the gold trade. And it's also evident, as you say, the Times reported on the eve of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, there was Hemeti with Lavrov and Shoigu and so on. So there was that. But what I'm hearing on the Russian side is that Lavrov is pulling back from that and is trying to say we just want a peace between the two sides, and they have no and so you've got a situation where there's a business ties between Hemeti and Prigozhin of Wagner, but the Russian government does not want to go out on a limb and back what essentially is seen as the insurgent paramilitary force under Hemeti, which is attacking the Sudan National Army under General Burhan in Khartoum. So it's going to try and stand back. So that is the complexity of it, where you've got Egypt, again, a traditional Russian ally, supporting the Sudan armed forces. and America, the US, and Saudi Arabia trying to broker a peace between the two. So I don't see any great advantage for Russia as a country and the Putin regime in supporting Hemeti, because in the longer term, it's looks very unlikely that Hemeti will prevail over a united Sudan.
Nyagale Bakayoko, when it comes to Sudan, I mean, we can call up a map of the gold mining areas. One can only wonder, as with Russia's involvement in Africa, if precious minerals are more than just a means to an end here.
No, I fully agree with what Patrick just said. Yes, there is this traffic, gold traffic, most of the time to Dubai and the Arabic Emirates. But what is of particular importance for Russia is the access to the Red Sea. It's been a very important geostrategic, important aspect of the way in which Sudan has been considered, and the way in which Russia does not want to make a choice between the two leaders, Hemeti and al-Burhan.
Frédéric Petit, earlier in the conversation, you heard Nyagale Bakayoko emphasize the fact that what Wagner brings to African countries, a lot of it is a means of amplifying their message, a point also hammered home by Kevin here. What does France do now in the face of all of this? How does it handle those countries like the CAR, like Mali, like even ones that are outside of their traditional realm, like Sudan? What do? Do they just sit back, or is there a message France should be hammering home?
Yes, I will say I will answer your question first, and then I will propose something else. For your question, I think that the position of France in all these regions changed in 2018 in Ouagadougou, and I think that we changed our mind. There is a very good document written in 2 years ago. There is a new law that we voted in the parliament for the development aid, and we are trying to get out this post-colonialism attitude and to change. But before the Wagner came to Africa, this was already started in France. For me, this point is very important. It's clear that we are under stress for that, but there is a lot of things. What happened last week for the finance, for example, it was to find a new way. It was to stop Bretton Woods. It's not something that it's not a little history for 2 years. It's a big evolution, and as a big evolution, I think also that I can't know anything about what happened in Kremlin, but our way to improve our knowledge, from my understanding, has to be in the frame of the end of the KGB is during 40 years, 30 years. It's not because there were the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and so on. It was only periphysically.
It's over long term. Frédéric Petit, I'm going to interrupt you because
yes.
we're having audio issues with Munich. I apologize for that. We're going to try to have those fixed. Kevin Limonier, if I understand what Frédéric Petit was saying there, it's over the long term that there has to be a review. What should the French leadership do? Nothing, perhaps, right now?
Well, I think, I'm not a specialist of Africa, but I think Russian presence in Africa, and especially in Western Africa, through some kind of criminal mafia, whatever you call it, like Wagner, etc., is a good opportunity for France to rethink its long-term strategy and partnership with these countries. I mean, this is the right moment maybe to sold out some of our old colonial legacies, according to me as a French citizen, if you ask me. Now, I think that there is also another matter which is quite important. We shall need the civil societies to develop and to grow in Western African country, because what we are witnessing now is a mutation of the Russian narratives in this part of the world. You were talking about Nathalie Yamb. I saw last week that she is now going into this pretty new topic for
This is one of these activists who's been very active on social media.
Yes, absolutely, she is. And she was talking about the Western corrupted influence of defending the rights of gay people, LGBT, and etc. So what we have here is a kind of collusion, a kind of ideological convergence between the old good Russian traditionalism, which is promoted by Putin for many years, and this is how he supported extremist, populist, far-right movements in Europe, for example, or in the US. And there is this convergence with all these Pan-Africanist, neo-Pan-Africanist movements, which are more and more going into this ground of societal issues and these kind of things. So we have to be very cautious about it. And I think that not only France, but Europe and the West has a big role to play to protect the civil societies, to help them to grow, to help the minorities to defend themselves.
So Patrick Smith, when you talk about the Mora massacre in Mali and you hear how Kevin Limonier describes how some of these activists cleverly turn this into a conversation about culture wars, how do the French react?
I think, as we've seen, the Quai d'Orsay, they have set up their sort of counter disinformation service under one of the most experienced ambassadors in Africa, actually. And so they already started doing this long before the last week's failed putsch against Putin. So that I think that is going to intensify. But what we're also hearing that both in the French government and in the U.S. government, there are intensive discussions about what should they do in the Sahel, in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, to beef up security, knowing absolutely that there's going to be now some sort of vacuum coming up. And we've seen that, the panic that has been described in a number of wire agency reports from Bamako about conditions there since the failed putsch. So I think you're going to see in the coming days a real push by both the French government and the U.S. government, and it'll be a more subtle one without some of the questionable political positions they've had in the past to offer no big bargain on the security, but just like unconditional help on security, trying to sort of reposition themselves as helpful against the jihadi push, in the hope that will enable them to re-establish good ties with Burkina, Mali, and other countries in the region. I mean, French ties with Niger are already pretty strong, but there is a growing anti-French sentiment in Niger as well.
Yeah, so the French, who have a military presence in places like Ivory Coast and Niger, the U.S. with their drone base near Niamey, is that the way it happens, Nyangele Bakayoko? Just focus on fighting the jihadist insurgent and don't give lessons on democracy? Is that the best way?
I don't know. What is sure is that the West as a whole has to make a clearest choice today between real politics or promoting liberalism and democracy and human rights, and not to have a double standard policy. The problem of Western actors, and France in particular, is a lack of clarity in the way in which interests and values are promoted. And that is where countries such as Russia are stronger, in my view, because their normative standards, their soft power is very clear. They are promoting an authoritarian and very conservative model from a moral point of view, which is also very attractive and maybe much more attractive than the liberal one, which used to be promoted by France and Western actors.
It's certainly something that we'll continue to follow as it continues to unfold. Nyagale Bakayoko, I want to thank you. I want to thank Frédéric Petit in Munich, Patrick Smith in London, Kevin Lemonnier. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.